Welcome to the Emotional Eating Unwrapped podcast. I'm your host, Alana Kessler, an emotional eating and weight loss coach for women looking to fall in love with eating, create healthy attachments with food, and lose weight sustainably. Hello and welcome to another new episode of Emotional Eating Unwrapped. I'm your host, Alana Kessler, and today we are diving into a question I get asked a lot, and I think you're going to really resonate with this one as well. The question is, why does emotional eating, why does binging, why does using food as a coping mechanism seem to affect women more than men? And now I'm not saying that doesn't affect men, because I do know men that struggle with emotional eating, but why does it seem like the narratives, the language, the messaging, the programs that we are in seem to have more women than men? So I want to address this because so many women, including myself, who struggle with emotional eating, you're not imagining that it is more women than men. Now, I also want to preface this by saying that I do think because women are more open about it, there might be some men that do struggle with emotional overeating and binging that maybe don't say it out loud, that aren't as vocal about it. And there might be a segment of men and more men than we know of or that we see that struggle with emotional eating. But for today's episode, I want to focus on what we see, what we seem to what we seem to live with in today's society, which is that more women do struggle with this coping mechanism than men. And there are very real reasons why women are more prone to turning to food for comfort, for stress relief, and even to feel a sense of control. And because of these real reasons, even though I do believe that men struggle, I know, and it has been seen time and time again, that women do struggle with this more than men. And it's not just because of willpower. It's not just because of, personal habits. It actually is about societal conditioning, biology. There's biological factors we're going to go into, and the sheer emotional labor that so many women carry. And that's emotional labor is now compounded into other types of pressures that women in the past perhaps didn't, women 100 years ago or something didn't really have. So, there's benefits to progressiveness, and then there's also added pressures that happen. So, there's no, we're not talking about something being better or worse. We're just talking about the reality. We're talking about the facts. So today we're going to break it all down. We're going to talk about the ways that society set up women for this cycle of emotional overeating, binging, quick fixes, yo-yo dieting, how our hormones play a role, and what we can actually do to start reclaiming our relationship with eating, to start understanding and feeling more empowered in our food choices and our, attachments to food, so that we can come from a place that feels really, really empowered and not so much about guilt or fear or worry. Okay, so let's start with something that I think we all feel, whether we realize it or not, which is the constant pressure on women's bodies. I think we all actually do realize it because it's so out there now. The conversation is out there amazingly. I think in the 50s, the 60s, even in the 90s, I think it wasn't as, it wasn't as like accepted to talk about how difficult it is to deal with this constant pressure, that from the time we're little girls, we're taught consciously or subconsciously to be aware of our appearance, to take note of how we look, to connect our looks, our appearance, our bodies with, things that perhaps it shouldn't be connected to, like our worthiness, our lovability, our attractiveness, as far as, our as far as attractiveness being a currency, right? Like that's kind of what we're taught. We see magazine covers. I remember being in the grocery store when I was growing up in the 90s, like Us Weekly or Teen Magazine or Cosmo, these bikini bodies, the latest diet, right? Like the Jennifer Aniston and her yoga arms and like all these different things. And then, as we've progressed into social media, there are these social media influencers, in the same kind of vein, right? And they even now do it under the guise of like self-care or even or even like even like body positivity in some sort of way. But underneath there's a bit of a narrative that's not as wholesome, in my opinion, right? Like when influencers are pushing detox teas, or like when they're saying that, you see a workout influencer or a wellness influencer touting that 20 minutes a day of Pilates and, 5 minutes of breath work and sitting in a sauna is going to give you, like is going to impact you in this way that's going to change your life and it's going to make you the most confident person ever. And she's clearly genetically predisposed to have an amazing figure, right? Like a toned figure, a societally accepted figure. It's a bit of a grift, in my opinion, right? Like it's a bit of a grift, and it's like saying two things, right? It's like love yourself as you are, and let it be, don't let it take up so much of your life, but I'm still going to be wearing barely anything, and I'm going to show you my genetically predisposed body that and kind of use it as currency to get you to purchase whatever I am touting at the moment, right? For me. And so there are a lot of these mixed messages. There are a lot of these messages that our worth is tied to our appearance, right? Like you don't see these influencers telling you this in, oftentimes in sweatpants. Maybe sometimes they're in sweatpants, but oftentimes they're also using their body as, as a sales page, right? So that can be a challenge, right? And if that wasn't enough, we're also bombarded by this idea that food is something that we have to earn, right? Like if you eat a salad at lunch, then you can have dessert later. If you, if you indulged on the weekend, then you work out extra hard during the week, or the opposite, right? If you want to enjoy some special meal or something on the weekend, then you have to work out extra hard. Like there's some sort of negotiation with exercise, right? You could be good, air quotes, if you're listening and you're not watching on YouTube, be good all week so you can have your cheat day, right? Like if this sounds familiar, this type of mindset, this type of cyclical thinking creates this toxic cycle of restriction, of overeating, where food isn't just food anymore, right? And it's not even something that you can enjoy, right? It becomes something else. It becomes a reward. It becomes something that fulfills a different type of emotional need, right? So it becomes a reward, or it becomes a punishment. It becomes like this moral choice. And when we inevitably break these impossible rules, right? Like when we put these rules on ourselves and we put these types of conditions on ourselves in order to make our eating choices valid, or acceptable, we inevitably break them. And what happens is guilt, shame, and this feeling of like, I have no control. And this is why emotional eating is so normalized for women, because we've been set up to turn to food as both the source of reward, right? So using food as a reward is very different than enjoying food as pleasure, right? We enjoy food as pleasure when we believe deep down that we deserve to experience the sensuality that feels good to us. We have it as a reward when we're exploiting taste in order to fulfill an emotional need or receive a certain feeling that we're looking for, like relief or something like that, or comfort. Okay. And then, and it also can be a form of escape, right? So when life gets hard, when stress is high, when we feel exhausted by expectations, right? Like the societal pressures that we feel, whether it's from family, whether it's from generational expectations, whether it's subconscious, conscious, whether it's magazines, whether it's social media, food then becomes a form of escape. Okay. And so we have that initial thing that is now constantly there, probably more than ever. Right? I know that social media just multiplies so much of this by a million, especially if you're following influencers that, like I said earlier, project a certain message, of empowerment, self-care, but they're constantly like naked, showing off these amazingly physically specimen bodies and selling something, telling you that you could get that, right? They're exploiting their genetics as currency. Okay. So beyond the societal pressures, there's also the biological reasons why we as women emotionally overeat more than men. So women's bodies are designed to go through hormonal fluctuations, right? They go through hormonal fluctuations during menstrual cycles, during pregnancy, during menopause. Yet we live in a world that is structured around men's biological rhythms. Men's biological rhythms. It is why oftentimes when we subscribe and follow masculine style programs that are very rigid with their rules, that are very follow this macro count, here's the metrics, that are very that, we lose our cycle if we do it too much, because it does, and then it doesn't work, right? Like it doesn't work long term for us because men operate differently than women. And a lot of the programs, a lot of the ways that society and these ways that we're taught to manage our weight and our diet and our eating is structured around a masculine energy type of situation. So men operate on a 24-hour cycle. And it's really important here to really specifically talk about men, because men have very different hormones than women, right? Their hormones reset every day, which is why, like I said, traditional diet and exercise plans are often structured with this in mind. Women, however, operate on a 28-day cycle. Our hormones fluctuate significantly throughout the month, influencing everything from our energy levels to our cravings to our emotions. And at different stages of your life, it's different, right? Like I know now at 44 years old, I am in perimenopause. I have an Oura ring and I look at my Oura ring every day and I see my hormones like whack, right? They're so different every day, different than they were 2 years ago. For sure, different than they were in my 30s. for sure different than they were in my 20s, right? Like maybe we have a 10-year period, 10 to 15-year period where it's somewhat consistent. But at least when you get to my age now, almost mid 40s, it's different now. It's really different now. So if you're listening to this, especially in this stage of life, the diet plans, the exercise regimens, they're just not, that are built around the male cycle, that are prevalent in society, are not going to work for you, right? They cater to a certain daily consistency, daily energy level. And it doesn't take into consideration the hormonal nuance that we have as women, right? Like our bodies don't respond the same way every day. We typically can't plan workouts like, we can't really plan workouts that much. We have to have some sort of flexibility. Like we can, but we also have to be able to handle some sort of level of flexibility, malleability, agility. Like we have to be able to pivot and adapt. And that's the beauty of feminine energy, femininity, right? Like feminine energy is all about that type of ability to stretch and to hold and to be willing to adapt. I remember what it felt like to be stuck in the cycle of emotional eating. I tried every diet out there, counting, tracking, restricting, but nothing ever worked. Food controlled my life, my thoughts, and I constantly felt guilty after eating. But once I learned how to heal the emotional triggers behind my eating and trust my body, everything changed. I stopped obsessing over food, the weight started coming off naturally, and I found real freedom in how I ate and lived. So I created the Sober Eating year-long mentorship to help other women experience the same transformation. So you can stop battling with food, you can lose weight without deprivation, and you can feel confident in your body again. In this mentorship, you'll have access to my proven nervous system rewiring method. You'll have access to live coaching with me, weekly accountability, and a community of women who truly understand your journey. You'll also have free access to my signature programs, the Emotional Eating Solution and Decoding Permanent Weight Loss, valued at $2,000. Click the link in the show notes to explore the mentorship today. You don't have to do this alone. I'll be right there with you every step of the way. So, for example, when it comes to our hormones, the days leading up to your period, serotonin levels dip, right? And serotonin is the feel-good chemical in your brain. Okay? And if serotonin levels dip, guess what we crave and what we want to help increase it? Simple carbohydrates, or even complex carbohydrates, and sugar, right? Carbs and sugar, things that break down into glucose molecules, right? That's why no matter how much discipline or willpower you think you should have, and no matter what meal plan is being told for you, if on day 25 of that generic meal plan, it's like it says one thing, but you are in a different place in your cycle, like it's just not going to work for you, right? Like if your exercise routine and the meal plan says one thing and you're feeling a certain way in your body, it's just not going to work for you. And abandoning your body is a number one way to trigger emotional overeating and binging. Maybe not in that initial moment, but it will not be a long-term, like the next time it happens, definitely it will. Right? And so your body is literally wired to, to crave certain things at certain times of the month. Like it's not weakness, it's biology. Right? And because we've been trained to fear cravings instead of understanding them, we often fight against our bodies, we restrict even harder. eventually until we can't anymore. And then, like I said, we overeat and then we feel guilty. The cycle repeats. And so if you've ever thought, why do I feel so out of control at certain times? I want you to know it is not you. It's the way that women's bodies are designed. And so when you learn to work with your body instead of against it, everything starts to shift. Right? Everything starts to shift. This is exactly the work we do in the Sober Eating Mentorship. So if that's something you're interested in, definitely check out that link. But you really have to learn how to work with your body. Okay. And then, when we talk about societal pressures, number one, right now we're talking about biology. The next thing I want to talk about, which is why, more women now are struggling with emotional overeating and binging and using food as a way to cope and to escape, is because there's the part of the conversation that so many women feel, but we don't always name, which is the mental and emotional labor that women carry every day. And I'm not saying all women, and actually I feel like I carry less than most women because I made a conscious choice, to not put so much pressure on myself by not having such a crazy household, right? I made, like, if you listened to the podcast before and you've heard my story, I was blessed to have this awareness and heal with all of the tools that I teach now very young, right? Like at 25 years old. So I had the awareness to know and to live from a place of a higher self and like a future self early on. And I made the decision not to have children, not to put extra burden on myself. But, a lot of what I've done instead is support women who have, because I have the capacity for it. Right. And I see every single day that so many women, they're not just managing their own stress, they're managing everyone else's too. Right. The invisible work of keeping a household running, the mental load, right, of remembering everyone's schedules, everyone's appointments, right, everyone's dinner, everyone's food preferences, right, the emotional weight of caregiving. And then, there's just expectations for women that I feel too, right? Like friendships, work expectations, family dynamics, right? A lot of men don't think about this stuff, right? Like, of course, they think of work expectations, but like I talked to my husband, and when I asked him about his friendships, it's like, what? It's not the same. Family dynamics are not the same, right? I don't feel as that men emotionally take care of people the same way that women do. And now women are also breadwinners. They're also taking care in the other realm, which is great. But we can't ignore the fact that now it's double load, right? We're double fisting it now, right? So if you're constantly taking care of everyone else, when do you get to be taken care of? And for many women, food is the only thing that gives them a moment to themselves. And it's not just the food. It's the eating. It's the act of eating, right? It's that ritual. It's like, this is my time, right? It's the thing that you reach for at the end of a long day because it doesn't ask anything from you, right? It doesn't ask you to listen. It doesn't ask you to be strong. It doesn't ask you to find solutions. It doesn't ask you to hold it all together. So the eating isn't just because of hunger. It's not just about the food. It's about relief. And this is why emotional eating, emotional overeating and binging, it's not just about making better choices. It's not just about someone telling you what you should eat and following it. Right? That's not going to help. It's not having someone tell you what they eat in a day, or some influencer giving you her 7-day meal plan with recipes. Like, it's not going to work. It's about understanding what you actually need and learning to meet those needs in a way that don't leave you feeling worse afterwards. And it's not a good trade-off. And here's the thing, when you're emotionally drained, you're going to crave comfort. When other coping mechanisms, more, maybe healthier coping mechanisms feel like they're unavailable or they're just too exhausting to invest your energy in at the time, food and eating becomes the easiest, most accessible source of relief for most of us. And if we're being real, it takes effort to draw yourself a bath. It takes effort to think about what you want to journal about. It takes effort to, do breath work or to sit down and paint and do a hobby, right? It just feels like another task. But eating, it doesn't. It feels like warm, right? It feels like resolution is on the other side, right? It's quick, it's easy. So emotional eating, binging, it doesn't just become about that food. It's not like ice cream or chips or muffins or cookies is the devil and like you need to just figure out how to never have that again. Because it's not about the food. It's about having a moment for yourself. It's about having a moment of something for yourself. And that's why when we heal from emotional eating, when we heal from binging, the focus is so deeply tied to self-care, right? Like we need to understand that emotional eating is not real self-care, right? We're creating this moment for ourselves, but it's not real self-care. It gives us this temporary relief instead of long-term healing. It's the quick fix self-care that we've been taught to settle for. And it's not sustainable. It's not what you want long-term. And it also eventually really does rob you from the joy and the pleasure that food and eating can give you. Okay, so how do we start shifting out of this cycle? How do we begin to take back control? Not by restricting or punishing ourselves, right? Not by, squeezing ourselves, turning ourselves into a pretzel, trying to fit into some masculine dominated program. But how do we do it? By creating real change. The first step, such a big step, is awareness. Understanding that these patterns aren't just personal struggles. This isn't just a you thing. They're systemic. They're biological. They're hormonal. They're ingrained in us from an early age. And when you see that, you can start to detach some of the shame, the perfectionism, the judgment that you have for yourself, right? You can remove that from your own individual experience. And here are some ways that you can start to shift your relationship with emotional overeating and using food in this way. You can learn to work with your body, not against it. Track your cycle. Like I said, I have the Oura rings. My Oura ring is really, it's helped me so much, right? When I see that I'm in a certain phase, like the luteal phase of my cycle, I know that some of the feelings and the food noise and the self-talk or like the urgency feeling that I have, I know it's hormonal and it helps me. It helps me to honor the moment I'm in and make decisions from that place. Right. And give myself, and create a way of being with eating and food for that period of time. Okay. You want to redefine self-care. Right. Instead of food being the place and eating being the place where you give yourself self-care, experiment with small, doable ways to soothe yourself. Not things that take up more energy, but things that give you back energy, right? Like just go outside and take a breath, right? Like just get some fresh air, change your vista, change your view. And then of course we want to challenge the diet culture narratives. So notice when you're falling into the trap of earning or deserving food, right? Like notice when you're doing that. and try to shift that. So this is another thing that we do together as a community in the sober eating mentorship, is we challenge these narratives, and then give yourself permission to eat without the guilt. And this is something that is a training. Okay, I'm not a fan, as you know, of the intuitive eating program movement. I think that you learn how to intuitively eat through the process of withdrawal from food addiction, slowly starting to train your nervous system to eat whatever, to eat what you love, in a way that is self-honoring. But you have to slowly train your nervous system to eat without guilt. You can't just bulldoze. You can't just say, all right, I guess I'll eat without guilt and that will happen, right? You only eat without guilt by taking baby steps to doing it, and really, like I said, and really just creating that resilience within your nervous system that you can eat whatever you want and you don't have to feel guilty about it. And you know exactly how to eat those foods so that you don't feel guilty about it. And that's personal for everybody. Okay, because the more that we create these personalized rhythms and routines for ourselves, and the more we validate and provide evidence to ourselves that we don't need to feel guilty, that we can eat whatever we want, that weight loss will happen without these strict, rigid rules, the more freedom we create. Okay, so before we end, just a final thought, just to wrap it up, we as women, we have been conditioned to feel like our struggles with food are personal, like they're personal failings, but they're not. They're learned. They're learned behaviors, whether consciously or unconsciously. They're biological responses and their survival mechanisms to changing of times and emotional pressures. And that means that because they're learned with awareness and with, slowly, consciously, intentionally applying new ways of being with food and eating, that means they can be unlearned. So I want you to know you're not broken and you're not failing. This isn't about willpower. This is about understanding and bringing an awareness to yourself in a deeper way, and then taking that awareness, inputting new ways of behaving, practicing that, getting feedback back, continuing to do it, and, building and becoming the version of yourself that you want to be, that doesn't have to sacrifice pleasure and joy for anything. Doesn't have to sacrifice freedom for anything. All right. So as always, I'm wishing you a week full of grace, self-compassion, and the deep knowing that you are not alone in this. All right. Thank you so much for listening. If you love our podcast, please subscribe on YouTube, subscribe on Spotify, Apple, give us a like, give us a thumbs up, and thanks again for listening. I'm Alana, and see you next time on Emotional Eating Unwrapped.